Well, this morning we're going to be looking at Psalm 139. Psalm 139. And this particular psalm was written by King David. And it's interesting because the last sermon that I preached here, I preached on David along with a few other biblical characters. And I talked about David as being a bully, being a bit of a bad parent. And now here I am preaching on one of his writings and showing his incredible ability to weave poetry and theology together. And that's one of the things I really love about God's Word, is how it shows these people who really messed up at times, and yet God used them. And that really speaks to us, to humanity, and how God uses us in spite of all of our faults. So in this one psalm, David outlines a basic theology of God. So this morning, we are going to Bible college, and we're going to have a theology lesson. We're going to touch on God's omniscience, His omnipresence, and His omnipotence. Now, the themes that are covered in this psalm may seem a little bit elementary for some of you here, especially those of you who've been Christian for a long time. But what I would encourage you to do is to pay particular attention to how David personalizes this theology. So this psalm has 4 sections to it. 4 sections, each of which have 6 verses. And David uses the first 3 sections to focus more on the theological nature. And then in that last section, he makes his petition to God. So with that, let us dive right in to Psalm 139. We'll start with verses 1 to 6. O Lord, you have searched me, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my laying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. You hem me in, behind and before. You have laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. God is omniscient. God is omniscient, which is to say that God knows all. God knows you. He knows you well. Verse 2, you know when I sit and when I rise. You discern my going out and my laying down. God knows you from your patterns. But your patterns might also be known by your mother, or your spouse, or your children. But whereas David describes God's knowledge as being far superior to this, far superior to human knowledge. Okay? God is not like a human, but one who is really, really smart. That is not a good comparison at all. You might think of how smart you are as a child, and then think of how smart you are as an adult. You might think, okay, well, I'll take that and multiply that by 2 or 3, and there's God. No, God's knowledge is on a whole different plane. So, for example, He doesn't just know us from our thoughts or our actions. Verse 2, he says, you perceive my thoughts from afar. Think about that. You perceive my thoughts from afar. I mean, I'm pretty close to you. I don't know what you're thinking. Doesn't matter how close I get, right? I'm getting closer and closer to Mike, but nope, I still don't know what he's thinking, right? But with God, He perceives your thoughts. No matter how far He is or close He is. Verse 4, before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely. Some of you probably don't even know what you're about to say until it comes out. And yet, God knows. God knows it. He knows us from our actions, but also from our thoughts, our intentions. Verse 6, such knowledge is too wonderful for me, David says. God's knowledge is beyond our human capacity or understanding. We just can't fathom God's knowledge. Now, to be so fully known by someone, I got thinking about that and thinking, that can be a little intimidating, a little vulnerable, even shameful. I remember when I was in grade 9, and when I was in grade 9, I had gotten into stealing. I had stolen some things from some stores, and there was a point at which my parents had become suspicious of me. And they sat me down, and my father started asking me questions about these things that I had acquired. And keep in mind, my parents knew my income, which was almost zero, other than the meager weekly allowance they would give me. And they recognized that here I had been acquiring some not so inexpensive things. And my father started asking me questions about these things. And he started asking me in a way that almost seemed like he was interested or genuinely curious. There's that part of me was thinking, I think he's onto me. But I don't dare say it. Because what if he doesn't know? What if he's just genuinely interested? I can't just spill the beans here, right? So I lied. And I lied again and again. And I came up with this whole elaborate scheme of how I had honorably come about these possessions. And this went on for a while until finally my dad looked at me and he said, "Scott, we know." Scott, we know. And with those 3 words, he knew me. And he left me feeling ashamed and vulnerable. And we all have those things. Maybe you haven't stolen something, but we all have those things that we feel ashamed of. Those things that we have told very, very few people, or maybe we've told no one. And yet God knows. But what's interesting, I find this interesting, is that this knowledge does not leave David feeling ashamed. Verse 5, "You hem me in behind and before. You laid your hand upon me," says David. David is saying that this complete knowledge that God has of you, it doesn't feel him feeling ashamed and unsafe and vulnerable. It actually leaves him feeling safe, secure, hemmed in, guarded, protected. I guess it's that, when others find out about our inner secrets, the concern is that they will judge us, and with that, reject us. But with God, he knows us, and yet he accepts us. He loves us. God is omniscient. He knows all. He knows you. Let's dive into that second section. So we're now looking at verses 7 to 12. Verses 7 to 12. "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light will become night around me. Even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you." God is omnipresent, which is to say God is everywhere. Everywhere. Now David starts this section with two rhetorical questions. There in verse 7, he asks, "Where can I go from your spirit? And where can I flee from your presence?" And of course, the answer is nowhere. That it's impossible. But David does answer these questions through verses 8 to 12. And what David does in those verses is he uses a literary function whereby he explains two extremes to indicate not just the extremes, but everything in between as well. So in verse 8, he talks about going to the heavens and then the depths, which is to say that as high up as I could possibly go, the heavens, you can't conceive anywhere higher than that. Or the depths, as low as I could possibly go. I will find God all the way up there. I will find God all the way down there. But the understanding, though David doesn't say it, but it's assumed, I will also find God everywhere in between. Then in verse 9, he talks about the dawn and the far side of the sea. So the dawn, where does the sun rise? The east. So as far east as I could possibly imagine, to the far side of the sea. And in this context, the sea is the Mediterranean Sea, which is to the west of Israel. So the far side of the sea is essentially to the end of the earth. So as far east as I could possibly imagine, to as far west as I could possibly imagine, I will find God. And again, the implication is, and God is also everywhere in between. What's interesting is that while David cannot escape the presence of God, nor does he want to. And I think of that as being interesting because I can't think of anyone that I would never want to escape from at some point in time. Anyone. I mean, I think of my wife. I like my wife. I do enjoy being with her. Honestly, I do. However, are there times when I need a break from her? And she from me? Absolutely. Absolutely. My son, Spencer. I love my boy. And you see me playing with him before service and after service. You know how much I love my boy. But do I want to be with him 24 hours a day, every single day of the year? I need some breaks. I do. My friends, I have some good friends. I enjoy the time I have with those friends. I also enjoy the time I have apart from them. Verse 10, even there you will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. You know, here David is describing God's presence as something that is wanted all the time. It is an ongoing presence. And it is a presence that is comforting and personal. Wherever you are, at home, at work, at church, when you're camping, when you're playing sports, with family, when you're on your own, wherever you are, God is with you. And this is a personal presence. A personal presence. What do I mean by that? Well, you know, if I say, you know, I felt alone while walking alone in the forest, that's one thing. If I say to you, I felt alone while in a crowd or at a party, that's a completely different thing. You understand what I'm saying? God is not just with you. God is with you. He is with you. He holds you tight. He hems you in, close by his side. His hand is upon you. God is omnipresent. God is with you always. Jumping into that third section, We're looking now at verses 13 to 18. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are too wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book, before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, O Lord. How vast the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. God is omnipotent. Omnipotent, which is to say that God is all-powerful. Now, what I find interesting about this section is that David does not highlight this by giving all the examples, and there'd be an infinite number of examples, of the things that God created, right? Listing off, sun and moon and stars and asteroids and earth and mountains and seas and trees and all the rest. That's not what God does here. And I think, that's probably what we would do if we were talking about the power of an individual, right? If we're talking about a really, really powerful man, or woman, we might talk about, how much they can lift, or how fast they can run, or maybe how wealthy they are, or what possessions they have. Or if we were talking about a powerful company, we would talk about it in terms of the wealth of that company, or what types of buildings, or bridges, or skyscrapers, or stadiums that company has built. But David takes a different tact here. Instead of listing all these things God has done, he highlights that God is the giver of life. And he personalizes this. God is the giver of David's life. Verses 13 and 14, for you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Imagine that. The God of the universe, who created everything that you can conceive of and everything you can, that God is interested in you. He's interested in you. I heard a story, and I actually think it's fictitious, but it bears an interesting point, so I just want to kind of share it. A lady was at a party, which included such guests as Winston Churchill and Mother Teresa. And while at that party, she got to talk to Winston Churchill and to Mother Teresa. And while talking to Winston Churchill, and those of you who don't know Winston Churchill, he was the Prime Minister of Great Britain during, was it World War I, World War II? Second World War, thank you, World War II, okay? Very powerful man. And she said, after talking to him, I felt like I was talking to the most important person on earth. And she then said, after talking to Mother Teresa, I felt like I was the most important person on earth. God's supremacy is not a supremacy that actually distances us from Him. To the contrary, God's supremacy is such a supremacy that it actually brings us closer to Him. Verse 16, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. God knows you. Now, this particular verse can be a little bit challenging to interpret. Those who come from a Calvinistic tradition would likely interpret this verse to mean that God has ordained your days in such a way that He has already determined who will be saved and who won't be. I tend to interpret this verse differently. I tend to see it as meaning that God extends to us the choice to accept His grace or not accept His grace. Now, He has the foreknowledge to see what choice we are going to make. And it's a real choice. But he still extends to us that choice and knows which direction we're going to take. However you interpret this verse, one way or the other, the key is that this verse is sandwiched between verses that talk about the intimate and precious relationship that God has with David. That God has ordained all of your days. That God knew you before you even could conceive. Before you were born. He knew you then. But he didn't just know you as a fetus. At that moment in time, he also knew your entire history. Every decision you'd ever make. Good, bad, he knew you. And he continued to accept you. And he continues to accept you. And to love you. And he declares that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. If you are someone who struggles with a low self-esteem, I would really encourage you to take some time to really read over and reflect on these verses. Certainly the entire Psalm 139, but especially verses 13 to 18. To know that God knows you, he created you, he knew how you would turn out, and he still created you, and he still loves you. And he declares that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. We're going to jump into that last section, verses 19 to 24. If only you would slay the wicked, O God. Away from me, you bloodthirsty men. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord, and abhor those who rise up against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Up until now, David is focused on the nature of God, on his omniscience, on his omnipresence, on his omnipotence, and what it means to him. But now in this last section, David deviates from the theological focus and he makes his practical request. Here, David asks God to destroy, to kill those who are evil and who hate God. Verse 19, if only you, God, would slay the wicked away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. And then David differentiates between himself and his enemies, those who are evil. I find this section rather difficult. Weren't we just talking about the sanctity of human life? And now David is calling on God to kill. It's a hard section to relate to. And I guess one of the reasons it's such a hard section, at least for me to relate to, is because David was a king. And I am not a king. Not a president, I'm not a prime minister. Nor have I ever been. And I'm going to make the assumption that we don't have any kings or presidents or prime ministers in the room today. I'm just going to go with that anyways. And further to the point, I don't have any enemies. I mean, true enemies. The way that David had enemies. Yes, there might be people at work that I kind of disagree with, or a family member that I got into an argument with, or maybe there's a neighbor I just don't care for. But unlike David, I don't have, at least to my knowledge, anyone who really wants to actually kill me and take my kingdom, which I don't have. And it's unlikely that you have that either. So it is hard to relate to this section. It's hard to kind of take some nice little take-home point from this, I find. To help us, I do think it's important to consider the genre of this literature. That's always important. So, this is not a historical book. This is not an author who is writing about things that have happened in the past. This is also not a prophetic book, which is to say this is not an author writing about things that are yet to come. It's also not one of Paul's epistles, so these are not instructions that have been given to a church telling them how to live out their lives or how to conduct service. No, this is a song. It is a prayer. It is a personal conversation between a man and his God. And I think that does help us a little bit in interpreting this. See, I've never been a king, and I've never been in that position, but I've never been necessarily in a position of having people wanting to literally kill me. But I have been in times where I feel lost, confused, shaken, just not sure what to do. I think all of you here know who Spencer is when I say my son's name, my firstborn son. Maybe fewer of you know that while he is my firstborn child, he is Kate and my third child. The first two children did not make full term. Sydney, after 2 months, was found to be ectopic. We don't know Sydney's gender. Didn't find that out. Skylar, after 3 months, it was about 3 months, was missing. And so we did not get to meet Skylar or Sydney. Those were hard times. Those were really hard times. Those were times where you want to take verses like you find here, and you want to believe that yes, God is by my side, and God is around me at all times, and He is present, and I can just speak to Him, and it just feels so empty. It feels so empty. And you have people coming to you, well-meaning people, and maybe some of you were part of these people, and you come and you try your best to cheer us up, and we thank you for that. Sometimes people would tell us of their own losses, and sometimes people would say, well, God has a purpose in all of this, or God needed that little child for His own, but none of it seems to suffice. Call out to God, and it's by your side. No, it feels like God is 100 miles away. And maybe on that level, maybe you can't relate to being a king, and maybe you can't relate to losing a child, or maybe you can, but maybe you have your own time, or maybe you're even in that time where you don't feel close to God. You're in one of those sort of deserts in your faith. this series is on powerful prayers. And, you know, when I think about this passage, I think about how David spends 3/4 of his prayer, of his song, reflecting on how awesome God is, how wise, how vast, how powerful, and what that means to David. And only after he does that, only after he reminds himself, only after he builds up his own faith, does he then go and make his request to God. And maybe that is one of the secrets of a powerful prayer. Maybe one of the secrets of a powerful prayer is that we don't start off just by offering up our laundry list of requests to God. Maybe what we sometimes need to do, especially when we're in those times where it feels like we're at such a distance from God, maybe we need to remind ourselves of who God is and who He is to us. And if there's a second secret to powerful prayers, maybe it is in approaching God from a humble stance. You know, throughout this passage, we see in this psalm that David describes God as being very big and himself in comparison being very small. And while yes, David does sound a little bit boastful or even vile at the end there in that last section, he then finishes off with these two verses, 23 and 24. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. He bows to his God. When you go to God in prayer, start off by remembering who it is you pray to. How vast, how wise, how knowledgeable, how loving, how graceful, how miraculous, how loving, how kind, how gentle. And approach Him with knees bended, with a humble heart. We're going to go to God in prayer. And as we go to God in prayer, we're going to do this a little bit differently this morning. We're going to have 4 people pray this morning to represent the 4 different sections of this song. And I've asked Mike Rutter to start our prayer off by focusing on God being omniscient and all-knowing. Our prayer will be continued on with Diane McPherson, focusing on God as being present with us at all times. Dave Lux will continue our prayer with the focus of God as being all-powerful. And the 4th person to pray will be you. Will be you. And as these 3 have ushered us into the presence of the Lord, we will then have where you're able to make your request known to the Lord. So with that, let us pray.
Lord, we thank you that you are a God that knows the beginning from the end. We thank you that you have a plan for our life that's good. And Lord, we just pray that we'll know the steps that you lay out before us, and that we'll learn your voice and learn to hear it, Lord. And we'll be obedient as we move forward. Lord, we're so grateful for all the blessings that you've given us. And we just pray that we'll learn to rest and have confidence that the steps we're taking are led by you and ordained by you and are part of your purpose for us, Lord.
Lord, it's so hard to accept the fact that you are everywhere and that you will never leave us alone. No matter how fast and hard we try to run from you, you are there with us. And all we need to do is reach out to you, acknowledge, embrace, and live life with you. Even though we may forget about you when we're doing well, and we may be in such pain in the depths of despair. Lord, you are there with us. You're always there with us. Let us just learn to accept the truth, the fact that you will never leave us. And you want us to be there with you in every part of our lives. So Lord, let us run to you, not from you, because you are right there with us.
Father, we can read time and time again in your word how powerful you are, and we know that you can step into huge situations and you can bring about change. But we're awed by the fact that you can step into our lives and that you can bring change in our lives. That you know every situation that we go through, every hurt, and you know the happy times and the joyous times. You know the times when we mess up. And when we put our faith, we know when we put our faith in you, that you can change us, that you can heal us, that you can give life back to us. And we know that when our days on this life are done, if we put our hope and our faith and our trust in your Son, Jesus, that you give us life beyond this earth and in an everlasting relationship with you. And we're just so thankful for that.
Lord, we offer these requests to you now, knowing that you hear us, knowing that you're close. Amen. Amen. Thank you. We're going to transition at this time to a time of offering. I'm going to ask those who are doing the baskets maybe to start that process now. There's two sets of baskets, of course. The first set is what you take out of, pens, envelopes, cards, that sort of stuff. If you're visiting us today, we encourage you, this service is our gift to you. Don't feel that you need to put any money in the offering. But if you would like to be involved, just to fill out one of those cards. And then the second set of baskets that go around will be what you put everything back into. For John and the gang, Lucas, any questions, any comments? Then we'll leave it there. Oh, one, Grace. You're right here, Scott.
Thanks for your thoughtful message on prayer.
Thank you.
And I think we always need encouragement in prayer, including me. But I just wanted to say about King David that the fact of him reflecting on God's omniscience, omnipresence rather, because David spent a great deal of his kingship being hunted down like an animal. And he had to believe that his life was in God's hands because he never knew when it was going to come to an end. And he often was delivered from tragedy, being murdered and stuff like that. So for him, that was a reassuring thing. And of course, he did other things that were not so praiseworthy, obviously. So he experienced both sides of what it means to realize that God is omnipresent.
Absolutely. Thank you for that reminder. All right. Well, John, will you lead us?
I was looking for songs for this week. It was funny because I was going to do this song earlier in the service, and I don't know why, but I switched it to him. I'm kind of glad I did. The song's called Anchor, and I really feel like this one's going to work today, so why don't I stand and we're going to sing this together.
Your word stand unshakable. There is hope in the promise of the cross. You gave everything to save the world you love. And this hope is an anchor for my soul. Our God will stand unshakable.
You may be seated. We're going to let you go in a second. I want to thank you for being with us. Scotty, thank you for your sermon. It was real. It was a very deep message we needed to hear today. And you know, over the summer we've been talking about depression, anxiety. We've been talking about, you know, those low times, right? Those times we're hard, we're struggling, we're dry, and all those kind of things. And you may be sitting here going, who are these sadists? You know, that are bringing us through these things. I want to say something. This is a path for us. A Christian isn't perpetually down, but we go down to go up. Okay? So there's victory and hope coming. Next week at Dangerous Prayers, I'm going to talk about the prayer break me. And you go, oh man, again, you know? But this prayer, and I want to share for you the times I've gone through this capacity and to see the power of God working around us. There's something about in us that when we humble ourselves, the author of Philippians said, Christ, for the joy set before him, endured the cross. There's something about Christians, and we get worked on a little bit, and we get beaten down, and we get in these places where our hearts are broken, that end up producing something powerful and miraculous, not only in our lives, but in the lives of those around us. Okay? So there is a method to our madness. We're bringing you through this because we're going to help Christ fulfill something in you that is going to bring great change in your life. All right? So stick with us. Next week, break me. Okay? We'll see you then. Thanks for being with us. Do us a favor and grab a couple vegetables on the way out. And I want to thank the crew and everybody today. They did a great job. God bless you. We'll see you next week.